The old woman stood outside the bakery, counting a few crumpled bills in her trembling hands. She was short by just enough to leave her hungry. People passed her without looking twice, until a black janitor quietly stepped forward and bought her bread with his own money. He thought it was nothing more than one small act of kindness. But hours later, that same woman walked into the building where he worked, surrounded by executives and security guards. She wasn't homeless. She wasn't helpless. She was a billionaire CEO, and she had witnessed something that would change his life forever. But why had she been treated so differently because of the color of her skin? And what did she plan to do after discovering the truth? Stay until the end, because the answer would expose something no one in that building was prepared to face. Marcus Reed had never expected his life to become extraordinary. At 36, he worked as a janitor at one of the most prestigious corporate buildings in the city. Every morning, he arrived before sunrise, unlocked the service entrance, put on his faded uniform, and began cleaning offices that belonged to people who rarely noticed he existed. Marcus was a black man, quiet by nature, and the kind of person who believed dignity came from how you treated people when nobody was watching. He lived modestly, sent part of every paycheck to help his elderly mother, and saved whatever remained for the future. He had never cared much about wealth or status. What mattered to him was kindness. That morning had started like every other. Marcus spent hours polishing marble floors, emptying overflowing bins, and cleaning conference rooms where executives had left behind expensive coffee cups and untouched food. Then, during his lunch break, Marcus stepped outside the building. Across the street stood a small bakery. That was where he noticed her. An elderly black woman stood near the entrance, holding a paper bag and staring down at the money in her hand. She looked exhausted. Her coat was worn, her shoes were scuffed, and there was something painfully familiar in the way she kept counting the same bills again and again. Marcus watched as several people walked past her. Some glanced at her, others deliberately looked away. Then something happened that made Marcus stop. The woman tried to buy a simple loaf of bread, but she didn't have enough money. Marcus didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from, and he certainly had no idea that the woman standing quietly outside the bakery had a connection to the very building where he worked. He simply knew what it felt like to have someone look at you and decide you weren't worth noticing. So Marcus reached into his pocket. He had only a few dollars left until payday. He spent them anyway. What Marcus didn't know was that someone had been watching the entire moment. And before the day was over, that tiny act of kindness would bring him face to face with a world of money, power, prejudice, and a secret far bigger than he could have imagined. Marcus thought buying the bread would be the end of the story. It wasn't. When he returned to the corporate building, he noticed something unusual. A black luxury SUV had stopped outside the main entrance, surrounded by two security vehicles. Several executives were rushing toward the lobby, their expressions tense. Marcus barely paid attention until he saw the elderly woman from the bakery step out of the SUV. She was wearing a completely different coat now, but Marcus recognized her immediately. Within minutes, the entire atmosphere of the building changed. The woman was treated with extraordinary respect. Executives surrounded her. Security guards opened every door. Employees lowered their voices as she walked through the lobby. Marcus stood in the distance, confused. Then he discovered the truth. The woman was Eleanor Whitmore, the founder and CEO of Whitmore Industries, a billionaire whose company controlled several major businesses across the country. She had arrived unexpectedly for a private meeting with the executives. Marcus suddenly understood why everyone was acting differently. But Eleanor hadn't come to discuss business. She had come because of him. She had remembered the janitor who spent his last few dollars to buy bread for a stranger. Marcus was called into a conference room, where several senior managers were already waiting. Instead of gratitude, he felt something colder. They were worried. They wanted to know why he had approached Eleanor outside the bakery. They questioned whether he had known who she was. They searched for a hidden motive behind an act that had required nothing from them. Marcus could feel the suspicion building around him. Then one executive quietly suggested that employees should avoid interacting with important clients outside the building. Marcus said nothing. He had heard that kind of judgment before, not because of what he had done, but because of what some people assumed about him. The situation became worse when a security supervisor accused Marcus of following Eleanor from the bakery. Another manager questioned whether he belonged near the executive entrance at all. The humiliation was becoming impossible to hide. But Eleanor had been watching. She had heard everything, and then she revealed something that left the room silent. She hadn't merely been testing the kindness of strangers that morning. She had deliberately gone outside without her usual security team because she wanted to see how ordinary people treated someone they believed had no money, no power, and no importance. What she witnessed disturbed her. People ignored her. Some avoided her. And when Marcus helped her, the reaction inside the company was even more revealing, because the same people who praised Eleanor when they believed she was a billionaire were questioning Marcus when they believed he was just a black janitor. Then Eleanor placed a folder on the conference table. Inside were security reports, employee complaints, and months of documented incidents involving black workers at the company. Marcus wasn't the only one. And suddenly, the bread he had bought that morning wasn't just an act of kindness. It had opened the door to a truth the company had spent years trying to keep hidden. The conference room fell completely silent. Marcus stood near the door, his hands still at his sides, while the executives stared at the folder Eleanor had placed on the table. For years, Marcus had learned to endure small humiliations without reacting. Being ignored in the elevator. Being asked to use the service entrance even when the main doors were empty. Being watched more closely than other employees. Being treated as if his uniform made him less deserving of respect. He had always told himself it was easier to stay quiet, but now Eleanor was showing him proof that he had never imagined. The folder contained complaints from black employees who had been denied promotions despite excellent performance. Reports of workers being accused of theft without evidence. Security records showing certain employees were repeatedly followed through the building. And then Marcus saw his own name. There were notes about him. One described him as someone who should be monitored around executive areas. Another questioned why he had access to certain floors. None of the reports mentioned poor performance. They mentioned suspicion. Eleanor looked across the room at the executives, and for the first time, their confidence disappeared. Then she revealed the most shocking piece of evidence. The company had been preparing to fire Marcus. His performance reviews were excellent. His attendance was nearly perfect. His supervisors had repeatedly praised his reliability, but one executive had secretly recommended replacing him with a contractor because, according to the internal notes, Marcus did not fit the image they wanted visitors to see. Marcus felt the room close around him. Years of working before sunrise, staying late, and quietly doing his job suddenly seemed invisible. His entire future had been placed on a judgment he could never control. Then Eleanor stood. She explained that she had deliberately walked into the bakery that morning wearing old clothes and carrying only a small amount of cash. She wanted to know whether people would treat her like a human being when they believed she had nothing. Marcus was the only person who had helped. But what happened afterward was even more revealing. The moment executives discovered she was wealthy, they treated her like royalty. The moment they looked at Marcus, they treated him like a threat. That contrast was impossible to ignore. Eleanor turned toward the executives and announced that she had made a decision. She was freezing the company's largest expansion contract, not because Marcus had asked her to, not because she wanted revenge, but because she could no longer invest billions into a company that treated its own employees according to the color of their skin. The executives panicked. Their careers, bonuses, and reputations were suddenly at risk. Marcus remained silent. For once, he wasn't the person being forced to explain himself. The people who had judged him were the ones being questioned. Then Eleanor walked toward him and placed the original bakery receipt in his hand. It was only a small piece of paper, but it represented something far bigger. Marcus had spent a few dollars to give an old woman something to eat. That simple act had exposed a system worth millions of dollars. And as the executives watched Eleanor walk out beside the janitor they had considered invisible, one terrifying truth became impossible to escape. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can reveal the ugliest truth hiding behind the biggest doors. The conference room emptied slowly. Executives who had spent years making decisions for thousands of employees suddenly had to answer questions they had avoided for far too long. The evidence Eleanor had uncovered could no longer be dismissed as misunderstandings or isolated incidents. There were patterns. There were complaints. There were employees who had quietly walked away because they had become exhausted from constantly proving they deserved the same respect as everyone else. Marcus watched it all without celebration. He had wanted fairness, not revenge. Within days, Eleanor ordered an independent investigation into the company's treatment of black employees and other workers who had experienced discrimination. Several senior managers were removed from their positions, while the company's policies on hiring, promotions, security procedures, and workplace complaints were completely reviewed. Marcus's own situation changed almost overnight. The termination recommendation against him was cancelled. His employment record was cleared of the suspicious accusations that had been placed beside his name. More importantly, he was fired finally recognized for what his performance reviews had always shown, a dependable worker who had done his job with dignity even when the people around him refused to give him the same dignity in return. Eleanor offered Marcus a promotion into a new employee's support role. He almost refused, not because he didn't appreciate the opportunity, but because he knew there were hundreds of other workers whose stories had never been heard. Instead, Marcus asked for something different. He wanted the company to create a program that allowed employees to report discrimination without fear of retaliation. He wanted promotions to be based on documented performance rather than personal assumptions. He wanted managers trained to recognize racial bias before it became normal workplace behavior. Eleanor agreed, and Marcus became one of the people helping build it. But the most meaningful moment happened weeks later. Marcus returned to the same bakery where everything had started. He remembered the elderly woman standing outside, counting her money. He remembered how little he had thought about his own financial situation when he decided to help her. This time, he bought 2 loaves of bread, one for himself, one to leave behind for anyone who needed it. The story could have ended there, but what Marcus had learned was much bigger than one bakery, one company, or one act of kindness. Racism does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides inside assumptions. It appears when one person is considered suspicious while another is considered trustworthy. It appears when someone's qualifications are questioned because of their skin color. It appears when a person is treated as invisible until someone discovers they have money, influence, or power. And that was the uncomfortable lesson Eleanor had discovered that morning. She had walked into the bakery looking like someone society could easily ignore. Marcus treated her like a human being. The people inside the corporate building treated her like a billionaire. Those two reactions revealed something about the world that money alone could never fix. Marcus never became obsessed with the fact that Eleanor was wealthy. He remained the same person. He still arrived early. He still helped co-workers. He still cleaned offices that belonged to people who might never remember his name. But something inside him had changed. He no longer believed staying silent was the only way to survive. He understood that dignity was not something another person had the power to give or take away. And Eleanor understood something too. A company could publish diversity statements, hold meetings, and put inspirational words on its walls. But none of that mattered if employees were still being judged differently because of the color of their skin. Real change had to appear in everyday decisions, in who gets trusted, who gets promoted, who gets listened to, who gets protected, and who gets treated as though they don't belong. The bread Marcus bought that morning had cost only a few dollars, but its impact reached far beyond the bakery. It exposed prejudice that had been hidden behind expensive suits and polished conference rooms. It reminded an entire company that a person's worth cannot be measured by their clothing, their job title, their bank account, or the color of their skin. And perhaps that is why the story of Marcus stayed with everyone who heard it. Because most people will never have the opportunity to expose a billion-dollar company. Most people will never meet a billionaire CEO on the street. But everyone has ordinary moments when they decide how to treat another human being. A glance, a judgment, a helping hand, a decision to speak up, a decision to look away. Those moments may seem small, but sometimes they reveal who we really are. Marcus had started that morning as a janitor nobody seemed to notice. He ended it as the person who reminded a powerful company that kindness, fairness, and human dignity cannot be reserved for people with money. And the elderly woman who couldn't afford a loaf of bread? She never forgot the man who helped her when he believed she had nothing to offer him. Neither did Marcus, because in the end, she didn't change his life by giving him wealth. She changed it by proving that one small act of kindness can become powerful enough to expose an entire system. So the next time you see someone who looks different from you, works a job society doesn't celebrate, or seems to have nothing to offer, remember Marcus. Because you never know what someone is carrying behind their silence. And you never know how much your simple decision to treat them with dignity might mean. The question isn't whether we would help a billionaire. The real question is much harder. Would we still choose kindness if we believed that person had nothing to give us in return?